The year is 1770. The place is Bengal, India. The land is cracking open. The great Ganges River, the mother of life, has shrunk to a skeletal stream. The rice paddies, once lush and green, are fields of dust. A famine, a Mahadurviksha, has fallen upon the land. But this is no ordinary drought. This is a nightmare. People are eating leaves. Then they are eating grass. Then they are eating the dead. The streets of Calcutta are piled high with corpses. The living are too weak to burn them. The air is thick with the silence of a dying population. In the end, 10 million people die. 1/3 of the entire population of Bengal. 10 million. This was not just a natural disaster. It was a man-made atrocity. A catastrophe engineered by a level of greed so profound it defies imagination. But the perpetrators were not a barbarian horde. They were not a mad tyrant or a conquering sultan. The entity responsible for these 10 million deaths was not even a state. It was a corporation, a British joint stock company listed on the London Exchange. Its name was the East India Company. While 10 million people starved, the company's private army was sent door to door, village to village, to collect taxes by force from the dying. They banned the hoarding of rice, seizing private stockpiles to control the market. And as the famine reached its peak, the company increased the land tax from 10% to 50%. They recorded their highest profits that year. How? How did a simple group of British merchants who arrived in India seeking to trade spices gain the godlike power to tax, to rule, and to starve an entire subcontinent? This is not the story of a nation conquering another. This is the story of something far more terrifying. This is the story of the first and most powerful multinational corporation in history, and how it used a private army, systemic corruption, and pure unfiltered greed to secretly conquer a nation, all for the sake of shareholder value. Our story begins 170 years earlier in London. The year is 1600. Queen Elizabeth I, in the final years of her reign, signs a royal charter. She grants a small, unassuming group of 218 merchants a monopoly on all trade east of the Cape of Good Hope. They call themselves the Governor and Company of Merchants of London Trading into the East Indies. We know them as the East India Company. Their goal was not conquest, it was commerce. Specifically, it was spice. In the 17th century, spices like pepper, cloves, and nutmeg were the equivalent of oil or microchips today. They were obscenely valuable, but the English were late to the game. The real power in the East was the Dutch East India Company, the VOC. The Dutch were ruthless, better funded, and controlled the spice islands of Indonesia. After a brief, bloody conflict, culminating in the Amboina massacre where Dutch agents tortured and executed English merchants, the East India Company was forced to retreat. Beaten, they turned their gaze to a secondary market, a place the Dutch didn't care as much about: India. For their first 150 years, the company was not a conqueror. It was a tenant. It was a guest. The Indian subcontinent was ruled by the mighty Mughal Empire, one of the richest and most powerful empires in the world. The company was a tiny, insignificant player. Its directors had to beg and bribe Mughal emperors just for permission to build small fortified warehouses, which they called factories, in coastal cities like Surat, Madras, and Calcutta. They were merchants, not masters. They were acutely aware of their vulnerability. They were thousands of miles from home, surrounded by a civilization far older and, at the time, far more sophisticated than their own. But in these small, paranoid coastal settlements, the seed of the monster was planted. The company directors argued they needed protection. Protection for their warehouses, for their pepper, for their textiles. So, they began to hire local guards. They took local Indian soldiers, mercenaries and farmers, and armed them with European muskets and trained them in European tactics. They called them sepoys. This was the birth of the East India Company's private army. It was, at first, a security detail. But the merchants in London, reading the quarterly reports, quickly realized a stunning fact. A well-trained soldier was a fantastic investment. And in the chaos of 18th century India, that investment was about to pay off. The turning point came in the early 1700s. The mighty Mughal Empire, which had held India together for centuries, began to collapse. With the death of the great Emperor Aurangzeb, the subcontinent fractured. It broke apart into a chaotic patchwork of competing kingdoms, rival princes, and warring Nawabs, governors. There was a power vacuum, and the East India Company, as the old saying goes, abhors a vacuum. The company directors realized that their investment, their private army, could now be used for more than just defense. It could be used to influence the chaos, to pick winners and losers. They were no longer just merchants, they were becoming kingmakers, and their chief kingmaker was a man who should never have been a soldier, Robert Clive. Clive was not a general, he was a writer, a low-level corporate clerk, sent to Madras at age 19. He was depressive, insubordinate, and had reportedly attempted suicide twice. He was, by all accounts, a miserable desk jockey, but he was also a natural-born military genius, with a sociopathic lack of fear and an instinct for opportunity. In the 1750s, the French and British companies in India began fighting a proxy war, backing rival Indian princes. Clive, with no formal training, took command of the company's small sepoy army. He won a series of impossible victories, most famously at the Siege of Arcot, where he held a town for 50 days against an army of 10,000. He became a national hero. But his true masterpiece of corporate malfeasance was yet to come. It was a single battle that would transform the company from a trading firm into an empire. The Battle of Plassey. The year was 1757. The new Nawab of Bengal, Siraj-ud-Dowlah, was young, arrogant, and, correctly, deeply suspicious of the British. He captured the company's base in Calcutta. This is where the infamous Black Hole of Calcutta incident allegedly occurred, a story of dubious anachronistic exaggeration, which Clive used as a perfect piece of wartime propaganda. Clive, now a lieutenant colonel in the company's army, marched from Madras to retake Calcutta. He had 3,000 soldiers. The Nawab of Bengal had 50,000. The battle that followed, on June 23, 1757, should have been a massacre. It wasn't, because it wasn't a battle at all. It was a business transaction. Clive, the corporate raider, knew he couldn't win a fair fight. So he didn't fight one. He initiated a hostile takeover. He secretly contacted the Nawab's most powerful general, a man named Mir Jafar. He made him a simple offer. In the middle of the battle, if Mir Jafar would betray his master and stand down, the East India Company would make him the new Nawab of Bengal. Mir Jafar agreed. The battle was a farce. It was over in hours. Clive's 3,000 men faced only a tiny fraction of the Nawab's army. The rest, under Mir Jafar's command, simply stood and watched. Siraj-ud-Dowlah fled, was captured, and was later executed. Robert Clive, the corporate clerk, had just conquered a kingdom richer than England itself. He had done it not in the name of the king or for the glory of Britain, but in the name of the East India Company. He placed Mir Jafar on the throne as promised, and his puppet Nawab immediately paid the price. He gifted the company an enormous sum and made Clive himself one of the richest men in the world. The mask was off. The East India Company was no longer a guest in India, it was the new landlord. The victory at Plassey opened the floodgates. The company, now the de facto master of Bengal, had evolved. It was no longer a kingmaker like the Praetorian Guard. It was something far more terrifying. In 1765, after another decisive military victory, the company marched on the weakened Mughal emperor in Delhi. They forced him, at gunpoint, to sign a document. This document, the Treaty of Allahabad, granted the East India Company the Diwani of Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Diwani was a simple word with catastrophic consequences. It meant the company now had the right to collect taxes from 20 million people. This is the moment the beast became a state. The transformation was complete. A private for-profit corporation based in a small office in London had just become the sovereign ruler of a foreign nation. It was a state, but a state with no responsibility to its citizens. It had no duty of care. It had no interest in justice, infrastructure, or welfare. It had only one function, one single purpose mandated by its charter: to deliver profit to its shareholders. And it did. The looting of Bengal began. The company's new tax collecting machine was brutally efficient. In the first few years, it doubled the tax revenue, bleeding the kingdom dry. The wealth that flowed back to England was so vast, it destabilized the British economy. Company employees, known as nabobs, became fabulously, grotesquely wealthy. Robert Clive himself returned to England with a personal fortune estimated at over £40 million in today's money. He walked into Parliament not as a general, but as the wealthiest self-made man in Europe. The system was one of pure, unrestrained extraction. The company's private army enforced the will of its tax collectors. The company's private courts enforced its contracts. And then, in 1769, the rains failed. This brings us back to our cold open, the Great Bengal Famine of 1770. We now see why it happened. When the drought began, the company's response was not humanitarian, it was financial. Their priority was the bottom line. Company officials and their local agents began stockpiling rice, creating an artificial shortage, and selling it at massively inflated prices. As the population began to starve, the company raised taxes, demanding that the dying peasants pay their share. When they couldn't pay, the company's private army was sent in to seize their last remaining grain and tools. 10 million people perished. A company official, Warren Hastings, would later admit, and notwithstanding the loss of at least one-third of the inhabitants, the net revenue collected in 1771 was greater than in 1768. The company did not see this as a tragedy. They saw it as an inefficiency in the market. They had created a hell on earth, and their shareholders had never been richer. The blood money from Bengal funded the company's final transformation. It was no longer just a state. It was an empire, a private corporate empire. With the limitless tax revenue of Bengal, the company's army exploded in size. It grew to 100,000 men, then 200,000. By 1850, the East India Company commanded a private army of over 260,000 soldiers. This was twice the size of the entire British Army. It was the largest, most sophisticated, and most profitable standing army in the world. And it was owned by a corporation. For the next 50 years, the company used this army as a ruthless corporate tool to expand its market share. This was not war for territory, it was war for profit. They launched the brutal Anglo-Mysore Wars, finally killing their great rival, Tipu Sultan, and looting his fabled treasury. They shattered the powerful Maratha Confederacy in a series of wars that gave them control of central India. They conquered the Sikhs in the Punjab, annexing the last great independent kingdom. They even invaded Afghanistan and were catastrophically defeated. But it was the company, not the British taxpayer, who footed the bill. They started the Opium Wars with China, not for any political reason, but to force China to buy opium, which the company was growing in India. They were, quite literally, the largest drug cartel in history. By 1857, the East India Company, a firm run by a board of directors in London, was the undisputed master of the Indian subcontinent. It commanded 250 million people. It had become the monster that even the Praetorian Guard could only dream of being. But like the Praetorians, this beast had become too big, too arrogant, and too powerful, and it was about to be destroyed by the very weapon it had created. The weapon was its own army, the Sepoys. On May 10th, 1857, the Sepoys rose up in what the British called the Great Mutiny, and what Indians call the First War of Independence. The trigger was a rumour that the new rifle cartridges they were issued were greased with a mixture of cow and pig fat. To bite them would defile both Hindu and Muslim soldiers. This was the spark. The fuel was a century of pent-up rage against the company's brutal racism, its crushing taxes, and its arrogant destruction of their culture. The rebellion was savage. Both sides committed unspeakable atrocities, but the company's response was a new level of corporate terror. They tied captured rebels to the mouths of cannons and literally blew them to pieces. It was a message of ultimate annihilation. The company, with the help of the actual British army, eventually crushed the revolt, but the violence was so extreme, so shocking, that the world could no longer ignore it. The British Parliament in London was horrified, not for moral reasons, but because the company had become a liability. It had mismanaged its property and started a war that had cost the British Crown a fortune. In 1858, the British government did what it should have done a century earlier. It passed the Government of India Act. The East India Company was dissolved. Its private army was absorbed into the new British Indian Army. Its territories were nationalised. Its power was stripped. The British Raj, direct rule by the Crown, had begun. The company, the most powerful corporation in history, was ended not with a bang, but with an act of Parliament. Its shareholders were simply bought out. The legacy of the East India Company is the world we live in. It was not a state. It was a corporation that acted like one. It was the dark and bloody prototype for a new kind of power. A global private entity that is unaccountable to any nation, any law, or any morality other than the bottom line. It was the brutal truth of what happens when profit becomes the only God.